Okay, we're going to talk about the Ducati Bevel Twin head and the bevel gear assembly here. The principal components are obviously the head, the distribution case, I guess it would be called, camshaft obviously, and the bevel gear shaft and the cam bevel gear. Alright, first thing to start with is this bearing here. It's held in a steel bush, and this is a double row self-aligning ball bearing, and the principal reason for that is because the shaft has this old hand coupler at the far end, and sometimes there's a little slop in it, and so this bearing is designed to handle a couple of degrees of misalignment. Let's see. This bearing bush holder, what you need to do is you measure the depth of it, because it's got a lip on this side. You measure the depth of it and then compare that to the width of the bearing. The bearing is going to be pretty consistent. These little bushes quite often vary a little bit because they're machined rather than ground. And so what you do is you have to measure it, figure out the difference, and then you have this little shim back here that you install, and they come in various thicknesses. You just have to find the right depth to basically make this thing flush. Alright. The camshaft is carried by 3 ball bearings, and one of them is a floating bearing on the interior here. And this floating bearing is located by the camshaft, these little spacers, and this fixed ball bearing in the bevel holder. And that, of course, is held in place by the gear and the nut, the cam nut. So what you want to do, slide your cam in. There we go. Put your spacers on there. And I've already obviously preloaded that bearing to the correct depth, so I'm not going to worry too much about the alignment on that. It's already done. I have a headache. Put the gasket on. Throw this guy on. Okay. I'm going to not tighten these screws because that center bearing being floating, if you tighten this before you have your other cam in block in place, it can cock the camshaft in the head, and you'll never get this in or never get it back out once you do get it in. So you want to be careful not to do that. In fact, you know what? I'll just demonstrate it. And this shouldn't go in. You can see it doesn't even want to, it won't even go in to start. And that's because it's misaligned. If you loosen this up just a bit, slides right in, then tighten this down. Okay, and I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes at this time, obviously. Okay, slide right back out. Nice and easy. Next step, let's drop our bevel shaft in there. This is a jig I made up, by the way. Makes it much easier to do this sort of stuff. Forgot about the timing marks. The bevel gears come with these 2 timing marks. Thank my daughter for the bright red fingernail polish. And right there you can see the factory grinding marks, and the factory had a jig for setting up these gears to the proper engagement, and what they did is they set them up in the jig, then did a proving grind on that basically, and that way if you ever take it apart, all you got to do is make it back to the same location, and then you know it's set up properly. You don't want the thing offset or too proud of one or the other. It have to be exactly the same depth, engagement depth. So anyways, slide that guy in, line the timing mark up, get the camshaft on there, and you can see that there's lots of slop in here between either of the gears. Okay, and so what you need to do is line it up on the grind, the proving grinds, to approximately where they're meshed properly, and just let it drop down. And you can come back with a dial indicator, you can set it up, and you can actually measure how much you need to shim if you're very careful doing that. And that will give you a very close approximation of where you need to be. Okay, so on this guy, let's put my shims on here. Personally, I like to have the thinnest shims against the gear because the bearing spins, and I figure that's just another wear point. As far as I'm concerned, that's a fixed point for that. So we got that guy on there. Slide that out, just hanging on the edge of the cam. Be careful with that because you can actually bend these shims because some of them are quite thin. The factory shims go from 0.05 millimeter, which is about 2.5 thousandths, up to 0.5 millimeter. And so you have to be very gentle with the thin ones. Okay, line that up. There we go, got it on. Okay, let's see what my nut. The cam nut's reverse thread, so it tightens to the left, not to the right. Get your cam holding tool out. If you're going to do this, make sure you get the right tools to do it. Don't stuff a screwdriver or a block of wood or anything in there. Do it right. Just tighten her up. All goes together nice and sweet. Let's line our timing marks up, go to the grinding marks, and then you can check it, and you want to make sure there's no overlap on it. And this thing's, I already set it up, so I'm not going to worry about it, but you might have to take it apart, put it together a few times before you get it right. Push the cam back in, gear down, get our shims off. The reason being is that you now have to locate this by a circlip and shims on the bottom side also. You don't want it moving up and down on that gear because you end up putting pressure on it and wearing it out. And here again, I've already shimmed this guy, so I'll just drop them on. Get your circlip up there. And what I like to do is to drop it down to within a millimeter or two of being in the retaining ring, and then push it on with a screwdriver. And then I listen for a nice snap. There we go. And that tells me it's in there. And you want to make sure it doesn't have any up or down play in it. And just to be certain, because sometimes you want to make it as tight as you can, just give it a little tap with your dead blow or rubber mallet to make sure that circlip is seated, which this one is. Alright. Okay, the next thing you want to do is you want to put the retaining cap on this bearing. Of course, it's got a gasket. Now be aware, this retaining cap is bidirectional, depending upon what cylinder head you want to put it on. Obviously this one has the fins going up and down, so that's the way you want to put it. You don't want to put it like that, because that would go on the other head. Alright, drop that on there. Turn it over, and put your screws in. Like that. Okay. Okay, got that back together. Oh, one thing I want to say. We have the keyway here, and quite often what will happen is that, seeing how the keyway is cut through these threads, when you tighten this nut up, it has a tendency to squeeze these threads together. And so you want to clean those up and make sure your key actually fits in this groove nicely before you put this thing together. If you don't, it's going to be a real headache to try and get that key underneath the nut, you know, between the sprocket and the nut. Alright, so that's something to think about, be aware of. There we go, back to there, and let's see. I don't know if I'm going to try doing that right now or not. Putting that back together. And of course you'd use the tab washers underneath. I like to use a tab washer and a little bit of medium Loctite on these things just to be certain that it's never going to come loose without my permission. Alright, now that we got it back together, you can nice and smooth. This guy even smoother. Alright. Next we'll do the closing rocker shimming. Okay, to shim your rockers, you have to have a couple of tools. Primarily is a temporary pin for your rocker replacement pin, a rocker pulling tool, and this is the holding tool for the closing rocker. It holds a spring so you can install it with the spring on. It's lots of fun. Okay. What you're supposed to do, this is a closing rocker for those that don't know it. The idea is to go and center these fingers on the fork stem, and I usually just eyeball it. You can get fairly accurate doing that. And hopefully you have a whole bunch of 10mm shims to play with. You can get it right. Like I said, on this one I already pre-shimmed it. Throw one in there and just see how it looks really quick. That looks good. Take our rocker out. Put our pin back in and hang this shim up on the edge of that pin just like that. And you can come back and carefully slide your rocker in place and check it. Hold it back against it. Looks good. Okay, the next thing, you got to do the other side. And here again, I like to have the thin ones against a piece of fixed metal. I'll typically sandwich them in between the pack of shims if they have any thin ones on here. Tweezers help, because you got to try and get all these shims now behind the rocker. And what I do is I'll push on the temporary pin just a little bit, just to hold them in place, and that way you can grab them again and then kind of just push them into place. There we go. Voila. You can see, you really don't want a lot of side-to-side play on here. You want to try and make it 0 if you can. Of course, I don't know if 0 is attainable, but you can sure get pretty close. This one obviously could use a little more. Alright, let's pull those out. Let's measure what we got to start with. It's about 63 thousandths. I think we can get rid of this little guy and go a little heavier. That's probably too much. That's 69. Let's try it and see how it fits. Here we go. That's pretty damn good. What little play you see in there is actually dimensional differences between the rocker pin and the rocker itself. It's not moving side to side, it's just kind of moving up and down a little bit. Alright, so now we got the shims set up properly. Let's take them back out. Pull the rocker out. There's a thin little guy there. The next thing we do is we put our closing spring on the rocker. It hooks under the rocker like that. And hook Mr. Spring on our little tool there. Here we go. You can see how it holds it in place somewhat as we install it. We can get our thin one back in. You have to be careful not to go and bend these thin shims. Alright, pin's in. Let's pull the pin back so we can expose where we want to put those other shims. little flat object like a screwdriver helps just to manipulate them. That's in. Next thing we do, now that we got the thing shimmed, we know it's right, gently pull this temporary pin out, which it just moved on me, so I got to stick it back in. Let's try that again. Alright, let's pull her out. Turkey. Okay, we're just going to try it without. We want to get the regular pin in there. Now when you put your pin in, make sure you don't stick it in the wrong end first. Make sure the threaded side is on the outside. If you aren't careful with that and you screw up, you're going to hate life. Okay, it's in to where the shims are kind of flopping around. This might be a bit of a headache to get in. Okay, I need to be able to spin that, so I'm going to put my puller on there. Being able to spin the pin helps align the shims. Okay, finally went in. And so now that it's in, you just pop your closing tool off and there you go. It's all set up. What a headache that one was. Alright, get my pin pulling tool back out. Wow, that's the bottom one. And next thing you want to do is actually put your closing shim on. Now, finally got the closing rocker shafts and shims in. This is a pain in the ass. Alright, I already shimmed up this closing rocker. See the thing nice and tight. Open there. It spins beautifully. No play, just a slight drag on the shoe. Let's do the next one. That's fine. It's right there. That's going to be a fairly shallow one. Okay. Let's spin the can to where, oh, I can just tell you right now it's too tight. Alright, so let's get it out.
This is
Let's use our little measuring tool and see where we're at. Okay, that's at 5.0. Alright, let's just try it. 50,000's down. That's very close. There's a tight spot right there. One of the things about these old Desmo cams is they're not concentric on the lobes, so they'll find a high spot. And there's the high spot, I think, right there. Let's try it like this. With the bonkers and the color, you can't see plenty on the sugar mountain. Well, you're thinking I'm not sure even what to say. Now you say you're leaving home 'cause you want to be alone. Ain't it funny how you feel when you find it out it's real? I don't know if it does any good to lift it up like that. When you see the cam, can you actually see the lobes? There we go. Coolio, huh? All right, and that's no springs. It spins nice and easy. Done.